Sarah Mitchell stood in the center of the Fort Bragg training facility, surrounded by 23 of the military's most elite trainers, each one staring at her with barely concealed skepticism. The silence was deafening as she prepared to demonstrate what they called kindergarten tactics and playground psychology. But when Master Sergeant Jake Rodriguez stepped forward from the back of the room, his weathered face breaking into a knowing smile, everything changed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades in special operations, "what you just showed us, that's straight out of the Delta Force operational manual." The room erupted. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." Sarah Mitchell had never imagined that her career in military training would begin with a room full of laughter directed squarely at her. At 28, she was the youngest civilian contractor ever hired by the Department of Defense's Advanced Training Division, a fact that seemed to follow her like a shadow everywhere she went. Her background in cognitive behavioral therapy and educational psychology had landed her this position. But as she stood before the assembled group of seasoned military instructors at Fort Bragg's prestigious Special Operations Training Center, she wondered if her credentials meant anything at all. The facility itself was imposing, a sprawling complex of concrete buildings nestled in the pine forests of North Carolina. The main training hall where she now found herself could accommodate over 200 personnel, with its high ceilings, industrial lighting, and walls lined with commendations from various Special Forces units. This morning, however, it felt uncomfortably intimate, with just 24 of the military's most experienced trainers scattered across the first few rows of seats, their arms crossed and expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Colonel Patricia Hayes, the facility's commanding officer, had introduced Sarah with professional courtesy but little enthusiasm. "Contractors like Ms. Mitchell represent the Pentagon's ongoing efforts to integrate civilian expertise into our training methodologies," she had announced, her tone suggesting she found the entire concept questionable. She'd be presenting some alternative approaches to stress, inoculation, and decision-making under pressure. The snickers had started immediately. Sarah caught fragments of whispered conversations, another desk jockey with theories, and wonder what university taught her about combat stress. She recognized the dynamic immediately. It was the same skepticism she'd faced when she first started working with at-risk youth in Detroit, where her unconventional methods had initially been met with ridicule from seasoned social workers and law enforcement officers. Sarah's approach had always been different. Where traditional military training focused on breaking down individuals to build them back up stronger, her methodology emphasized understanding the psychological triggers that cause people to freeze, panic, or make poor decisions under extreme pressure. She believed in working with the mind's natural responses rather than attempting to override them completely. The theoretical foundation of her work stemmed from years of research into neuroplasticity and stress response patterns. During her doctoral studies at Northwestern University, she had become fascinated by case studies of individuals who performed exceptionally well in crisis situations, not because they felt no fear, but because they had learned to channel their stress response productively. Her dissertation had focused on emergency room personnel, firefighters, and crisis negotiators, examining the mental frameworks that allowed them to maintain clarity and effectiveness when others would crumble. When the Department of Defense had reached out to her through a 30 consulting firm, Sarah had been intrigued but cautious. Military culture was notoriously resistant to outside influence, particularly from civilians who had never experienced combat. However, the preliminary briefings had suggested genuine interest in exploring new methodologies, especially given the increasing complexity of modern warfare and the psychological demands placed on special operations personnel. The contract had been lucrative and the challenge intellectually stimulating. Sarah spent 3 months preparing her presentation, studying military training protocols, interviewing former Special Forces operators, and adapting her techniques to fit the unique demands of military operations. She had been confident in her preparation, but nothing had quite prepared her for the reality of facing these hardened professionals whose experiences had forged them in ways her textbooks could never capture. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Thompson, a lean man in his 40s with prematurely gray hair and intense blue eyes, represented the vocal opposition in the room. His reputation preceded him: 22 years of active service, multiple deployments to Afghanistan and Iraq, and a track record of training some of the military's most elite units. When Sarah began her presentation, he immediately raised his hand. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "With all due respect to your academic background, what we do here isn't therapy. We're preparing warriors for life-and-death situations where hesitation means failure and failure means people die. How exactly does cognitive behavioral theory apply to a firefight in Kandahar?" The question had been fair, if bluntly delivered, and Sarah had expected it. "Colonel Thompson, you're absolutely right that this isn't therapy. What I'm proposing is training that works with the brain's natural responses to extreme stress, rather than trying to suppress them. When someone freezes in combat, it's not because they're weak, it's because their amygdala has hijacked their prefrontal cortex. Understanding that process allows us to develop specific techniques to maintain cognitive function under pressure." "Amygdala hijacking," repeated Sergeant First Class David Chun, a compact man whose arms bore the intricate tattoos common among Special Forces personnel. "Sounds like something you'd discuss in a college psychology class, not a military briefing room." Sarah had pressed on, explaining how her methods had been successfully implemented in high-stress civilian environments. She described her work with emergency medical technicians in Chicago, where her training program had reduced decision-making errors by 37% during critical incidents. She detailed her collaboration with SWAT teams in Phoenix, where officers trained in her techniques showed improved accuracy and reduced tunnel vision during active threat scenarios. The skepticism in the room had only deepened. Captain Rebecca Foster, whose background included extensive experience training military police units, had been particularly vocal. "What works for paramedics and local SWAT teams is hardly applicable to special operations. We're talking about operators who might be alone behind enemy lines for weeks, making split-second decisions with incomplete information and the lives of their team members hanging in the balance." Sarah understood their perspective. These were individuals who had dedicated their careers to preparing warriors for the most extreme circumstances imaginable. They had seen theories come and go, watched well-meaning civilians propose solutions that collapsed under the weight of real-world application. Their skepticism wasn't personal, it was professional, born from experience and a deep responsibility to ensure that the men and women they trained would return home alive. What they didn't realize was that Sarah's confidence wasn't based solely on academic theory. Her work with at-risk populations in Detroit had often involved life-or-death situations. Gang violence, domestic abuse scenarios, and crisis interventions had taught her that stress response patterns remained consistent across different environments. The teenager facing down a rival gang member experienced the same neurological processes as the soldier encountering enemy fire. The context was different, but the underlying psychological mechanisms were identical. Sarah's methodology centered around what she called adaptive stress integration. Traditional training often focused on desensitization, exposing individuals to stressful stimuli repeatedly until they became accustomed to them. Her approach was more nuanced. She taught people to recognize the early warning signs of stress overload, to understand how their bodies and minds responded to pressure, and to develop personalized coping strategies that worked with their natural tendencies rather than against them. The techniques themselves seemed almost simplistic to military professionals, accustomed to complex operational procedures. Sarah taught breathing exercises that could reset the nervous system in under 30 seconds. She demonstrated visualization techniques that could help maintain situational awareness during high-stress encounters. Her tactical empathy exercises taught individuals to read micro-expressions and body language cues that could provide critical intelligence during interactions with hostile or unknown individuals. To the assembled trainers, these methods appeared soft, even childish. Sergeant Major William Parsons, whose weathered hands bore the scars of multiple combat deployments, had summarized the prevailing sentiment perfectly. Ms. Mitchell, this might work fine for helping college students manage test anxiety, but we're preparing operators for environments where the enemy is actively trying to kill them. They need hard skills, not breathing exercises. The criticism had stung, but Sarah had encountered similar resistance before. Every innovative approach faced initial skepticism, particularly when it challenged established orthodoxy. She had pressed forward with her demonstration, asking for volunteers to participate in a simulated high-stress scenario. The exercise she had designed was deceptively simple. Participants would be presented with a series of rapidly changing, tactical situations displayed on multiple screens simultaneously. They would need to process information, make decisions, and communicate those decisions while dealing with deliberately introduced stressors, flashing lights, loud noises, and time pressure. Traditional training would focus on exposure and repetition until participants could perform despite the stressors. Sarah's approach taught participants to use the stress response itself as information. Only 3 trainers had volunteered, and their participation seemed more motivated by politeness than genuine interest. Gunnery Sergeant Maria Santos, a Marine with an impressive record in combat engineering, had agreed to participate first. As the exercise began, Sarah coached her through the recognition of her own stress responses, helping her identify the physical sensations that preceded decision-making. Difficulties. The results had been immediately apparent. Santos, who had initially struggled with information processing as the stressors intensified, began performing significantly better as she learned to interpret her body's signals. Instead of fighting against the adrenaline surge, she learned to use it as an indicator of situational importance. Her response times improved, her decisions became more accurate, and her communication remained clear even as the scenario became increasingly chaotic. The room had watched with growing interest, but skepticism remained high. Captain Foster had attributed the improvement to familiarity with the exercise rather than the effectiveness of Sarah's techniques. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson had questioned whether the artificial stressors in the training environment bore any resemblance to actual combat conditions. Sarah had anticipated these objections and had prepared a more complex demonstration. She had developed a scenario based on actual after-action reports from recent deployments, incorporating the type of ambiguous threat assessment and rapid decision-making required in modern asymmetric warfare. The exercise required participants to distinguish between hostile combatants and civilians in a crowded marketplace while managing multiple communication channels and adapting to changing mission parameters. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This time, Sergeant First Class Chun had volunteered, his competitive nature apparently outweighing his skepticism about Sarah's methods. As the exercise commenced, Sarah guided him through her stress integration techniques, teaching him to recognize when information overload was compromising his judgment and how to reset his cognitive processing without losing situational awareness. The transformation had been remarkable. Chun, who had initially become fixated on specific details and lost track of the broader tactical picture, began demonstrating the kind of flexible thinking that special operations demanded. He was able to maintain awareness of multiple threat indicators while processing new information and adapting his approach as the situation evolved. The room had fallen silent as they watched Chun navigate scenarios that had historically proven challenging even for experienced operators. His performance wasn't perfect, but the improvement over his initial attempts was undeniable. More importantly, he was able to articulate his decision-making process in real time, demonstrating the kind of cognitive clarity that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Even the most skeptical trainers had begun paying closer attention. Sergeant Major Parsons had leaned forward in his seat, his expression shifting from dismissive to thoughtful. Captain Foster had begun taking notes, her questions becoming more technical and less hostile. Sarah had sensed the shift in the room's energy, but she also recognized that she was still facing an uphill battle. These were professionals who had built their careers on proven methodologies, and they weren't going to abandon decades of experience based on a single demonstration. She needed something more of validation that would speak to their experience in a language they understood and respected. That validation was about to arrive in the form of Master Sergeant Jake Rodriguez, though Sarah didn't know it yet. Rodriguez had been observing from the back of the room, his presence almost unnoticed among the more vocal participants. His silence wasn't born from disinterest but from recognition. As Sarah continued her presentation, describing techniques for maintaining operational effectiveness under extreme duress, Rodriguez found himself remembering training he had received years earlier in a classified program that few people even knew existed. The pieces were falling into place in Rodriguez's mind, and he realized that what he was witnessing wasn't an academic exercise, but the civilian adaptation of methodologies that had been developed and refined in the most classified corners of the special operations community. The question was whether Sarah knew she was essentially reverse engineering techniques that had been born from decades of real-world application in the most dangerous environments on Earth. Master Sergeant Jake Rodriguez had been standing against the back wall for over an hour, his weathered hands clasped behind him in a posture that spoke of decades of military discipline. At 45, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived situations most people couldn't imagine. His face bore the subtle scars of operational experience, a thin line across his left temple from shrapnel in Fallujah, a barely visible mark on his jaw from a training accident that had gone wrong in the mountains of Afghanistan. Rodriguez wasn't supposed to be at this briefing. His official schedule had him reviewing personnel files for an upcoming selection course, but something about the civilian contractor's methodology had caught his attention when Colonel Hayes mentioned it during the morning staff meeting. The description of alternative stress management techniques had triggered memory fragments of training he had received 15 years earlier in a windowless facility whose location he was still prohibited from discussing. As Sarah continued her demonstration, Rodriguez felt a growing sense of recognition. The breathing techniques she taught weren't revolutionary. They were nearly identical to protocols he had learned during his time with a joint task force that officially didn't exist. The visualization exercises matched procedures that had been drilled into him during months of preparation for operations that remained classified at the highest levels. Most significantly, her emphasis on adaptive stress integration was essentially a civilian translation of what his instructors had called operational psychology optimization. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was a young civilian contractor being ridiculed by military trainers for teaching methods that Rodriguez knew had been developed, refined, and proven effective by the most elite units in the American military. The techniques Sarah was demonstrating hadn't originated in university psychology departments. They had been born from necessity in the field, crafted by operators who had learned through trial and error what worked when conventional training failed. Rodriguez's mind drifted back to Fort Bragg in 2009, though not to these familiar training halls. He remembered a different facility entirely, one accessed through a series of security checkpoints that required clearances most people would never possess. The official designation was Advanced Human Performance Laboratory, but everyone called it the factory. It was there that Rodriguez had first encountered the psychological training protocols that would later prove invaluable during his most dangerous deployments. The Instructor at the factory had been Dr. Angela Brennan, a former Air Force psychologist who had been recruited into classified programs after her groundbreaking work with pilot stress response. Dr. Brennan had explained that conventional military training was based on suppression, teaching soldiers to override their natural stress responses through discipline and repetition. Her approach was revolutionary. Instead of fighting against the body's stress response, operators could learn to harness it. Your amygdala isn't your enemy, Dr. Brennan had told Rodriguez's class. It's an early warning system that's been keeping humans alive for thousands of years. The problem isn't that it activates under stress. The problem is that most people don't know how to interpret what it's telling them. The training that followed had been unlike anything Rodriguez had experienced in 2 decades of military service. Instead of endless repetition designed to create automatic responses, Dr. Brennan's program taught conscious awareness of stress indicators and deliberate techniques for maintaining cognitive function under extreme pressure. The breathing exercises weren't about relaxation, they were about resetting the nervous system to maintain operational effectiveness. Rodriguez had initially been skeptical, much like the trainers now watching Sarah's presentation. His background was in direct action operations, where success depended on split-second decisions and flawless execution under fire. The idea that psychological techniques could enhance his performance had seemed academic and impractical. That skepticism had evaporated during his next deployment to Afghanistan. Operating with a small team in Helmand Province, Rodriguez had found himself in a situation that would have previously triggered tunnel vision and decision-making paralysis. The team had been conducting surveillance on a suspected Taliban weapons cache when their position was compromised. Enemy fighters had surrounded them, and conventional escape routes were blocked. In previous similar situations, Rodriguez had experienced the familiar stress response: elevated heart rate, narrowed focus, and the tendency to fixate on immediate threats rather than maintaining broader situational awareness. This time, however, he had recognized the early warning signs that Dr. Brennan had taught him to identify. Instead of fighting against the stress response, he had used it as information. The breathing technique had taken less than 15 seconds to execute, but it had cleared his thinking enough to notice details he might otherwise have missed. A slight variation in the enemy's positioning had revealed a weakness in their encirclement. Radio chatter had indicated confusion about the team's exact location. Most importantly, Rodriguez had maintained enough cognitive flexibility to recognize an opportunity for misdirection. Rather than direct confrontation, the team's successful extraction had been attributed to Rodriguez's tactical decision-making. But he knew the real factor had been his ability to think clearly under extreme pressure. The psychological techniques he had learned at the factory hadn't made him fearless. They had made him more effective while afraid. That deployment had been followed by others, each one confirming the value of the training he had received. Rodriguez had used the techniques during close-quarters combat in Iraqi urban environments, during high-altitude insertions in mountainous terrain, and during sensitive site exploitations where a single mistake could have compromised ongoing intelligence operations. The methods had become so integrated into his operational approach that he rarely thought about them consciously. They had become as fundamental as weapon handling or tactical movement. Now watching Sarah demonstrate nearly identical techniques to a room full of skeptical trainers, Rodriguez felt compelled to speak. These weren't theoretical concepts being proposed by an inexperienced civilian. They were proven methodologies that had been developed and refined by the military's most elite units. The fact that Sarah had independently arrived at similar conclusions through her civilian research was remarkable, but the techniques themselves had a pedigree that no one in this room would question if they knew its true origin. Rodriguez pushed himself away from the wall and began walking toward the front of the room. His movement drew attention, and several trainers turned to watch his approach. Sarah paused in her presentation, uncertain about the interruption, but recognizing the authority that Rodriguez carried even. Without saying a word, Miss Mitchell, Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the gravelly tone of someone who had spent years communicating over radio static and battlefield noise. I've been listening to your presentation for the last hour, and I have a question. The room fell silent. Rodriguez was known for his direct approach and his reluctance to speak unless he had something significant to contribute. His interventions during training discussions were rare, but always worth hearing. Go ahead. Master Sergeant, Sarah replied, bracing herself for another challenge to her methodology. Rodriguez moved to the center of the room, positioning himself where everyone could see him clearly. His expression was thoughtful rather than confrontational, and Sarah found herself cautiously optimistic about what he might say. The breathing technique you just demonstrated. Rodriguez continued, specifically the 4-count inhale, 6-count hold, 8-count exhale pattern. Where did you learn that sequence? Sarah felt a moment of confusion. The question seemed oddly specific, focusing on technical details rather than challenging her overall approach. I developed it through my research into parasympathetic nervous system activation, she answered. The timing is based on studies of optimal heart rate variability patterns during stress recovery. Rodriguez nodded slowly, his expression revealing nothing. And the visualization exercise where you had Sergeant Shun imagine a tactical situation from multiple perspectives simultaneously. That's something you created for this presentation. Not exactly, Sarah replied, sensing that this line of questioning was leading somewhere significant. It's an adaptation of perspective-taking exercises I've used in conflict resolution work. The idea is to maintain cognitive flexibility by forcing the mind to consider multiple viewpoints, even under pressure. Interesting, Rodriguez said, though his tone suggested he found it more than merely interesting. What about the technique where you taught him to use his stress response as information rather than something to overcome? That's a core part of your methodology? Sarah nodded, beginning to feel like she was being tested rather than questioned. Yes, that's fundamental to my approach. Most training tries to suppress stress responses, but I believe they contain valuable information about situational assessment and threat evaluation. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving around the room to make eye contact with several of the other trainers. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that made everyone lean forward to listen. Ms. Mitchell, what you've just demonstrated to this room, these techniques you've developed through your civilian research, I want you to know that they're not just theoretically sound. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I've used these exact methods in operational environments where failure wasn't just academic. It meant people died. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting from skepticism to intense interest. Captain Foster stopped taking notes and looked up sharply, her eyes moving between Rodriguez and Sarah with obvious confusion. I'm not sure I understand. Master Sergeant, Sarah said, voicing what everyone in the room was thinking. Rodriguez's expression became more serious, and Sarah could sense that he was making a decision about how much to reveal. Without going into details that I'm not authorized to discuss, I can tell you that certain units within our special operations community have been using these psychological training methods for over a decade. The specific techniques you've demonstrated aren't experimental. They proven protocols that have been developed and refined through real-world application. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah felt a mixture of validation and bewilderment. She had developed her methods through independent research, building on academic foundations and civilian applications. The idea that she had unknowingly recreated classified military training protocols was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. Sergeant Major Parsons was the first to break the silence. Are you saying that what Ms. Mitchell is teaching us is already being used by our own people? Rodriguez nodded carefully. What I'm saying is that the psychological principles she's describing have been proven effective in the most demanding operational environments our military faces. The fact that she's arrived at these conclusions through independent research speaks to their validity. The implications were staggering. If Rodriguez was correct, then Sarah's work wasn't just theoretically sound, it was operationally proven. More importantly, the techniques that had been developed for the most elite military units could potentially benefit the broader training community. Captain Foster raised her hand, her earlier hostility replaced by professional curiosity. Master Sergeant, are you suggesting that we should be incorporating these methods into our standard training protocols? Rodriguez's response was measured but clear. I'm suggesting that dismissing these techniques because they come from a civilian contractor would be a mistake. The psychological principles Ms. Mitchell has presented are sound, and their operational value has been demonstrated repeatedly in high-stakes environments. Sarah found herself in an unprecedented situation. The validation she was receiving went far beyond what she had hoped for when she accepted this contract. Rodriguez wasn't just endorsing her methods, she was revealing that they were already trusted by the military's most elite operators. But questions remained. How had classified military protocols found their way into civilian research? Were the similarities between her work and these operational methods purely coincidental, or was there some connection she wasn't aware of? Most importantly, what did this revelation mean for her role as a contractor and her ability to implement these training methods more broadly? The training hall buzzed with quiet conversations as the assembled instructors processed what they had just heard. The dynamic in the room had shifted completely. Sarah was no longer the outsider trying to convince skeptical professionals to consider her untested theories. She had become something much more significant, a civilian researcher who had independently validated classified military methodologies. Rodriguez seemed to recognize the impact of his revelation, and Sarah could see him weighing his next words carefully. The conversation was approaching territory that involved classified information and operational security considerations. How much more could he reveal without compromising sensitive programs? The answer to that question would determine not just the success of Sarah's presentation, but potentially the future of military training protocols across multiple branches of service. The weight of Rodriguez's words hung in the air like smoke from a distant battle. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, not from stress this time, but from a growing realization that her career might be about to take a turn she had never anticipated. Around the room, the faces of seasoned military trainers reflected a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and something approaching respect, a combination she hadn't seen since walking through those doors 2 hours earlier. Colonel Hayes, who had remained conspicuously silent during most of the presentation, finally stepped forward from her position near the door. Her silver hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform bore the ribbons of someone who had served with distinction across multiple theaters of operation. At 53, she had seen enough military innovations come and go to maintain a healthy skepticism about anything that promised to revolutionize training. "Master Sergeant Rodriguez," Colonel Hayes said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to cutting through ambiguity, "your statements are creating quite a stir in this room. Before we proceed any further, I need to understand exactly what you're claiming." Rodriguez straightened slightly, a subtle shift that indicated his recognition of the colonel's authority while maintaining his own professional bearing. "Ma'am, I'm claiming that the psychological training protocols Ms. Mitchell has demonstrated are not experimental theories. They are operational methodologies that have been tested and proven in classified training environments." The colonel's eyes narrowed slightly. As the commanding officer of one of the military's primer training facilities, she was cleared for information that went well beyond what most officers would ever see. If Rodriguez was referring to classified programs, she would either know about them or know enough to recognize the implications of what he was saying. "Are you speaking from personal experience, Master Sergeant?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Rodriguez met her gaze directly. "Yes, ma'am. I am." The simple affirmation carried enormous weight. In military culture, Personal experience was the ultimate credential. Academic theories could be dismissed, research studies could be questioned, but when a decorated special operations veteran stated that he had personally used specific techniques in operational environments, that testimony carried unassailable authority. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who had been observing the proceedings from the side of the room, chose that moment to step forward. As the civilian director of the Advanced Training Division's research arm, she had been the one to recommend Sarah's contract. Her background included a PhD in organizational psychology from Stanford and 15 years of experience working with various government agencies on human performance optimization. Master Sergeant Dr. Warren interjected, "I think what everyone is trying to understand is how Ms. Mitchell's independently developed research could so closely mirror classified training protocols. The probability of such convergence seems statistically unlikely." Rodriguez nodded, acknowledging the validity of the question. "Dr. Warren, that's exactly the right question to ask. And I think the answer is going to surprise everyone in this room." He moved toward the front of the room, positioning himself where he could address the entire group while maintaining visual contact with both Sarah and Colonel Hayes. His demeanor suggested that he was making a calculated decision to reveal information that he wouldn't normally share. "The techniques Ms. Mitchell has demonstrated aren't just similar to classified protocols," Rodriguez said, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone delivering a formal briefing. "They're identical in every significant detail." "That's not a coincidence." Sarah felt her breath catch. The implication was staggering. If her research hadn't been independent, if there had been some connection to classified programs that she wasn't aware of, the ramifications could be career-ending. Government contractors who mishandled classified information faced serious legal consequences, and the suggestion that she had somehow accessed restricted training materials could destroy her professional reputation. "Master Sergeant," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her racing thoughts, "I need you to understand that my research was entirely independent. I've never had access to classified military training materials, and I've never worked with anyone who indicated they were sharing restricted information." Rodriguez held up a hand, a gesture that was both reassuring and commanding. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm not suggesting that you've accessed classified information. What I'm telling you is something different, and frankly, something that's going to require Colonel Hayes' permission to discuss." All eyes turned to the colonel, who had been listening to the exchange with growing interest. Her expression revealed the internal calculation of a senior officer weighing operational security against the potential value of sharing certain information. After a long moment, she nodded slightly. "Proceed, Master Sergeant, but carefully." Rodriguez took a deep breath, clearly understanding the significance of what he was about to reveal. The psychological training protocols that certain special operations units have been using weren't developed by military researchers. They were developed by civilian contractors working under classified programs, and those contractors based their work on published academic research. The room fell silent as the implications of this statement sank in. Sarah felt a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. If civilian contractors had developed military protocols based on academic research, and if her own work was based on similar academic foundations, then convergent development wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. "Are you saying," Dr. Warren asked slowly, "that classified military training protocols were originally derived from the same academic sources that Ms. Mitchell used for her research?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Rodriguez confirmed. "The psychological principles behind stress management, cognitive flexibility under pressure, and adaptive response to high-stress environments aren't military secrets. They're well-established scientific concepts that have been published in peer-reviewed journals for decades." Lieutenant Colonel Thompson leaned forward in his chair, his expression shifting from skepticism to professional interest. "So the classified aspect wasn't the psychology itself, but how it was applied to military operations?" Rodriguez nodded. Correct, sir. The scientific principles were always available to anyone with access to academic literature. What was classified was the specific application of those principles to special operations training, the operational scenarios where they were tested, and the performance metrics that proved their effectiveness. Sarah began to understand the broader picture. Her research had been based on published studies of stress response, cognitive psychology, and human performance under pressure. The same academic foundation had been available to military contractors working on classified programs. The convergence wasn't mysterious, it was the natural result of multiple researchers applying established scientific principles to similar challenges. But there's more, Rodriguez continued, his expression becoming more serious. The reason I recognize Miss Mitchell's technique so specifically is because I was trained by one of the original contractors who developed the military protocols, Dr. Angela Brennan, who worked with task force applications that I can't discuss in detail. But I can tell you that her work was groundbreaking. The name meant nothing to Sarah, but Dr. Warren's sharp intake of breath suggested it carried significance in certain circles. You worked with Angela Brennan? Dr. Warren asked, her voice betraying genuine surprise. Rodriguez confirmed with a nod. For 6 months in 2009, and periodically for follow-up training sessions until 2012. Dr. Brennan's approach was revolutionary within the special operations community because it represented a fundamental shift from traditional military training philosophy. Colonel Hayes stepped forward, her expression indicating that she was familiar with the name as well. Dr. Brennan's work was legendary in certain circles, though most of it remains classified. Master Sergeant, are you suggesting that Miss Mitchell's methodology represents a civilian reconstruction of Dr. Brennan's protocols? Not a reconstruction, Rodriguez replied. An independent parallel development. Miss Mitchell arrived at the same conclusions through her own research path, which actually validates the underlying science more convincingly than any classified program could. Sarah found herself at the center of a revelation that went far beyond her original presentation. The techniques she had developed through years of civilian research weren't just theoretically sound, they represented the civilian rediscovery of methodologies that had been proven effective by the military's most elite units. Sergeant First Class Chen, who had participated in Sarah's demonstration earlier, raised his hand. Master Sergeant, you're saying that what Miss Mitchell taught me during that exercise is the same kind of training that Delta Force operators receive. Rodriguez paused, clearly weighing his words carefully. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Sergeant Chen, what Miss Mitchell taught you during that exercise isn't the same kind of training that elite operators receive. It is the training that elite operators receive. The statement hit the room like a physical force. The implications were staggering. Sarah's methodology wasn't just academically interesting or theoretically valid, it was operationally proven by the most elite military units in the world. Captain Foster, who had been one of Sarah's harshest critics, stood up slowly. Her expression reflected the internal struggle of someone whose fundamental assumptions were being challenged by undeniable evidence. If what you're saying is accurate, Master Sergeant, then we've been dismissing training protocols that could significantly enhance the performance of our students. Rodriguez nodded gravely. Captain Foster, that's exactly what I'm saying. The techniques Ms. Mitchell has demonstrated aren't experimental, they're proven. The only difference is that she's presenting them as civilian research rather than classified military protocols. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The presentation that had begun as an attempt to introduce alternative training methods had become something much more significant. She was potentially positioned to bring classified-level training techniques to the broader military training community. But questions remained. How much of the original classified research could be discussed in this forum? What were the legal and security implications of implementing these techniques in standard training programs? Most importantly, how could they ensure that valuable training methodologies weren't lost in bureaucratic concerns about classification levels? Dr. Warren seemed to be thinking along similar lines. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, given what you've revealed, what would you recommend as our next steps? Rodriguez looked around the room, making eye contact with several of the trainers who had been most skeptical of Sarah's presentation. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had earned his credibility through years of operational experience. I recommend that we stop questioning whether these techniques work and start focusing on how to implement them effectively. Ms. Mitchell has done something remarkable. She's independently developed training protocols that match the effectiveness of classified programs. That gives us an opportunity to enhance our training across the board without getting tangled up in classification issues. Colonel Hayes nodded slowly, her expression indicating that she was already thinking about the broader implications. Ms. Mitchell, it appears that your presentation has taken an unexpected turn. Instead of introducing experimental techniques, you've apparently demonstrated that your research has independently validated some of our most effective training methodologies. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and overwhelming responsibility. The skepticism she had faced earlier in the day had been replaced by something much more challenging, the expectation that she could help revolutionize military training on a scale she had never imagined. The room buzzed with quiet conversations as trainers processed the revelations they had just heard. Sarah realized that her role had fundamentally changed. She was no longer the outsider trying to convince skeptical professionals to consider her theories. She had become the civilian face of training methodologies that had already proven their worth in the most demanding environments the military could devise. Rodriguez approached her, his expression serious but encouraging. Ms. Mitchell, I hope you understand the significance of what just happened here. Sarah nodded, still processing the magnitude of the revelation. I'm beginning to, Master Sergeant. But I have to admit, I'm not entirely sure what comes next. Rodriguez's weathered face broke into a slight smile, the first one Sarah had seen from him. What comes next is that you stop worrying about proving your methods work and start focusing on teaching them to as many people as possible. Because if there's one thing I've learned in 25 years of military service, it's that good training saves lives. The fluorescent lights in the briefing room seemed harsher now, casting sharp shadows across faces that had transformed from skeptical to intensely focused. Sarah found herself surrounded by a group of military professionals who were no longer questioning her credibility, but rather grappling with the implications of what they had just learned. The shift in dynamics was palpable, and she could feel the weight of expectations that came with being repositioned from an outsider to a potential game-changer. Colonel Hayes moved to the front of the room, her bearing suggesting that she was transitioning from observer to active participant in whatever was about to unfold. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, before we proceed any further, I need to establish some boundaries around what can and cannot be discussed in this forum. Rodriguez nodded, understanding the colonel's concern about operational security. Ma'am, I understand the constraints. What I can tell you is that the psychological principles Ms. Mitchell has demonstrated have been incorporated into training programs for units that operate under the Joint Special Operations Command umbrella. The specific applications and operational contexts remain classified, but the core methodologies have proven their value repeatedly. Dr. Warren stepped forward, her notebook now filled with questions rather than observations. Master Sergeant, you mentioned Dr. Angela Brennan earlier. I'm familiar with her work from the academic literature, but I wasn't aware of her involvement in classified programs. Dr. Brennan's published research represents only a fraction of her contributions to military training, Rodriguez explained. Her classified work began in 2007, when the Pentagon recognized that conventional stress inoculation training wasn't adequately preparing operators for the psychological demands of modern warfare. Sarah listened with growing fascination. Her own research had cited several of Dr. Brennan's published papers, particularly her groundbreaking work on cognitive flexibility under extreme stress. Learning that there was an entire body of unpublished research built on those same foundations felt like discovering a hidden chapter of her own academic genealogy. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, who had been quietly processing the revelations, finally spoke up. If these techniques have been proven effective at the highest levels of special operations, why haven't they been integrated into our standard training protocols? The question cut to the heart of a fundamental challenge in military culture. Rodriguez's expression suggested he had grappled with this same issue throughout his career. "Sir, there are several factors at play," Rodriguez replied. First, the classification level of the original research created compartmentalization that prevented widespread dissemination. Second, there's been institutional resistance to psychological training approaches that seem to contradict traditional military values of toughness and resilience. Captain Foster, who had undergone a complete transformation from hostile skeptic to engaged participant, leaned forward in her chair. "Are you saying that politics and bureaucracy have prevented effective training techniques from being implemented broadly?" Rodriguez's silence spoke volumes. In military culture, direct criticism of institutional decisions required careful navigation, but his expression conveyed what his words couldn't explicitly state. Colonel Hayes intervened, recognizing the sensitive nature of the territory they were entering. "The important point is that we now have an opportunity to implement these techniques without the constraints that may have previously limited their application." Sarah found herself processing not just the immediate implications of the discussion, but the broader questions it raised about the relationship between classified military research and civilian academic work. The convergence of her research with Dr. Brennan's classified protocols wasn't just professionally significant, it represented a fascinating case study in parallel development and the flow of information between military and civilian research communities. "Master Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully, "when you trained with Dr. Brennan, were her methods significantly different from what I demonstrated today?" Rodriguez considered the question thoughtfully. The underlying principles were identical. The specific applications were tailored to operational environments that I can't discuss in detail, but the psychological foundations were the same. Dr. Brennan's approach emphasized understanding stress response as information rather than something to overcome, using cognitive flexibility techniques to maintain situational awareness, and developing personalized coping strategies that worked with individual psychological profiles rather than against them. The description perfectly matched Sarah's methodology, confirming the remarkable convergence that had brought them to this moment. But it also raised new questions about the path forward. Sergeant Major Parsons, whose initial skepticism had given way to professional curiosity, raised his hand. "Ms. Mitchell, given what we've learned today, how would you recommend implementing these techniques in our current training programs?" Sarah felt the shift in responsibility settling on her shoulders. The question assumed not whether these techniques should be implemented, but how to do it most effectively. The transition from defending her methodology to designing its application represented a professional milestone she hadn't anticipated. "The implementation needs to be gradual and carefully managed," Sarah replied, drawing on her experience with organizational change in civilian contexts. "These techniques work best when they're integrated into existing training frameworks rather than presented as replacements for established methods." Dr. Warren nodded approvingly. "That aligns with best practices for institutional change management. What specific steps would you recommend?" Sarah moved toward the whiteboard at the front of the room, her academic instincts taking over as she began to outline a systematic approach. "First, we need to identify training scenarios where conventional methods have shown limitations. Second, we integrate the psychological techniques as enhancements to existing protocols rather than replacements. Third, We establish metrics to measure effectiveness and gather data to support broader implementation." As she wrote on the whiteboard, Sarah became aware that the room's energy had shifted again. The military professionals were now engaged in the kind of tactical planning that came naturally to them. The theoretical discussion had given way to practical implementation considerations. Sergeant First Class Chun, who had experienced the techniques firsthand during Sarah's demonstration, offered his perspective. "Ma'am, from my experience in the exercise, these techniques didn't replace my existing training, they enhanced it. I was still using all the tactical knowledge I'd developed over years of service, but I was able to access it more effectively under pressure." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the point. These psychological techniques aren't about changing what operators know, they're about helping them access that knowledge more effectively when it matters most." The discussion continued for another hour, with various trainers contributing insights based on their specialized areas of expertise. Captain Foster discussed applications for military police training, particularly in situations involving crowd control and de-escalation. Sergeant Major Parsons explored potential uses in marksmanship training, where psychological factors often determined performance under stress. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson considered applications for leadership development, especially for officers who would need to maintain decision-making capability during prolonged high-stress operations. As the conversation evolved, Sarah realized that what had begun as an attempt to introduce alternative training methods had become a comprehensive planning session for institutional change. The validation provided by Rodriguez's revelation had eliminated the need to prove that the techniques worked. The focus had shifted entirely to determining how to implement them most effectively across different training contexts. Colonel Hayes, who had been listening to the discussion with growing interest, finally called for attention. "Ms. Mitchell, based on what we've discussed today, I'd like to propose expanding your contract to include a pilot implementation program." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The opportunity being presented went far beyond what she had hoped for when she first accepted the contract. Instead of conducting a single presentation to skeptical trainers, she was being invited to help redesign military training protocols on an institutional level. "Colonel, I'd be honored to take on that responsibility," Sarah replied. "But I want to be clear about the scope of what we're discussing. Are we talking about implementing these techniques within this facility, or are we considering broader application across multiple training commands?" The colonel's expression suggested she was thinking beyond the immediate facility. "Ms. Mitchell, if these techniques are as effective as Master Sergeant Rodriguez indicates, then we have a responsibility to ensure they benefit as many service members as possible. That means thinking about implementation across multiple commands, different branches of service, and various operational contexts." The magnitude of the opportunity was staggering. Sarah had entered the room that morning as a civilian contractor hoping to gain acceptance for alternative training approaches. She was now being positioned to potentially influence military training across the entire Department of Defense, but with opportunity came responsibility and risk. Implementation on such a scale would require navigating complex bureaucratic systems, overcoming institutional resistance, and maintaining effectiveness while adapting techniques to diverse operational requirements. The civilian research that had brought her to this point would need to be translated into military training protocols that could be standardized, measured, and continuously improved. Rodriguez seemed to sense her thoughts. "Ms. Mitchell, I know this might seem overwhelming, but I want you to understand something important. The techniques you've developed aren't just academically interesting, they're operationally critical. Every operator who learns these methods becomes more effective, more resilient, and more likely to complete their mission and return home safely." The personal dimension of Rodriguez's statement hit Sarah with unexpected force. Throughout her civilian career, her work had been focused on improving performance and reducing stress-related problems. The idea that her research could directly impact the survival and effectiveness of military personnel in combat situations added a level of significance she had never experienced. Dr. Warren, who had been quietly taking notes throughout the discussion, looked up from her notebook. Ms. Mitchell, from a research perspective, this represents an unprecedented opportunity to study the implementation of psychological training techniques across a large military population. The data we could gather would advance our understanding of human performance under stress in ways that civilian research contexts could never match. Sarah nodded, recognizing the research opportunities while remaining focused on the practical implications. Dr. Warren, you're absolutely right about the research potential. But I want to make sure that our focus remains on effectiveness rather than data collection. These techniques need to work in operational environments, not just in controlled research settings. The commitment to operational effectiveness over academic research reflected Sarah's growing understanding of military culture and priorities. The transition from civilian contractor to military training consultant required not just technical expertise, but cultural adaptation and an appreciation for the life and death stakes involved in military operations. As the meeting continued, Sarah found herself surrounded by military professionals who were no longer questioning her credibility, but rather seeking to understand how best to leverage her expertise. The transformation was remarkable, but it also represented the beginning of challenges she was only beginning to appreciate. Path from academic research to classified military protocols and back to institutional implementation would require navigating complexities that went far beyond psychological theory and training techniques. Sarah was about to discover that changing military culture, even with proven methods and institutional support, would test her abilities in ways she had never imagined. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's presentation at Fort Bragg, and the sterile conference room on the 3rd floor of the Pentagon felt worlds away from the training facility where her journey had begun. The mahogany table stretched before her, surrounded by faces that represented the highest levels of military training command. Unlike the skeptical trainers she had first encountered, these officers carried themselves with the quiet authority of those who made decisions affecting thousands of service members across multiple theaters of operation. General Patricia Kellerman, a 3-star officer with silver hair and piercing blue eyes, sat at the head of the table. As the Director of Training and Education for the entire Department of Defense, she possessed the authority to implement changes that could ripple across every branch of service. Her presence at this meeting signaled that Sarah's work had reached the highest levels of military consideration. "Ms. Mitchell," General Kellerman began, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to making consequential decisions, "your methodology has generated considerable interest throughout the training community." Colonel Hayes's initial report was compelling, and Master Sergeant Rodriguez's endorsement carries significant weight. However, before we consider large-scale implementation, I need to understand the practical challenges we're likely to encounter. Sarah had spent the previous weeks preparing for exactly this question. Her research into organizational change management, combined with extensive conversations with military personnel at various levels, had given her a realistic understanding of the obstacles ahead. General Kellerman, the primary challenge won't be proving effectiveness. Master Sergeant Rodriguez has already done that. The challenge will be cultural resistance from trainers who view psychological techniques as incompatible with traditional military values. Brigadier General Marcus Webb, whose weathered face bore the scars of multiple combat deployments, leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Mitchell, you're suggesting that our own training personnel will resist implementing techniques that could save lives?" Sarah chose her words carefully, recognizing that she was addressing officers who had dedicated their careers to military service. "General Webb, it's not about resistance to saving lives. It's about resistance to methods that appear to contradict established principles of military toughness and resilience." Many experienced trainers believe that soldiers need to overcome fear and stress, not work with them. The observation struck at the heart of a fundamental tension in military culture. For generations, military training had emphasized the suppression of natural stress responses through discipline and repetition. Sarah's approach required a paradigm shift that challenged deeply held beliefs about what made effective warriors. Colonel James Harrison, who oversaw training integration across multiple special operations commands, had been studying Sarah's detailed implementation proposal for several days. His background included extensive experience with innovation adoption in military contexts, making his perspective particularly valuable. Ms. Mitchell, Colonel Harrison said, "Your phased implementation plan addresses many of the cultural concerns, but I'm interested in the metrics you've proposed for measuring success. How do we quantify improvements in stress management and decision-making under pressure?" Sarah had anticipated this question and had worked with Dr. Warren to develop measurable outcomes that would satisfy military requirements for evidence-based training. Colonel Harrison will be tracking multiple metrics: decision-making speed and accuracy under simulated stress, physiological indicators during high-pressure scenarios, mission success rates in complex training exercises, and subjective assessments from both trainees and instructors. The metrics represented a compromise between academic rigor and military practicality. Sarah understood that military culture demanded concrete evidence of improvement, but she also recognized that the most important benefits of her techniques might be difficult to quantify in traditional ways. Major General Lisa Rodriguez, no relation to Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who commanded the Army's Training and Doctrine Command, raised a concern that had been weighing on several minds around the table. "Ms. Mitchell, there's an issue we haven't fully addressed. If these techniques are based on classified research, what are the security implications of implementing them in standard training programs?" The question touched on one of the most complex aspects of the entire initiative. Sarah had consulted with military lawyers and security specialists to understand the boundaries around what could be implemented publicly versus what remained restricted. General Rodriguez: "That's an excellent question, and it's one we've researched extensively. The psychological principles themselves were never classified. They're based on published academic research. What was classified was their specific application to certain operational contexts and the performance data from those applications." She paused to ensure everyone understood the distinction. "Our implementation will focus on the psychological techniques themselves, adapted for standard training environments. We won't be reproducing the specific operational applications or referencing classified performance metrics." The explanation seemed to satisfy most of the concerns around the table, but Sarah could sense that deeper questions remained about the relationship between her civilian research and the classified programs that had developed similar techniques. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a civilian psychologist who served as an advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff on human performance issues, had been quietly reviewing Sarah's technical documentation throughout the meeting. Her expertise in military psychology made her assessment particularly important for gaining institutional buy-in. "Ms. Mitchell," Dr. Morrison said, "I've reviewed your research methodology and theoretical framework. What impresses me most is not just the convergence with classified protocols, but the rigor of your independent development process. This gives us confidence that the techniques will remain effective even when adapted to different training contexts." The endorsement from another civilian expert carried significant weight in a room dominated by military officers. It validated Sarah's credibility while reinforcing the scientific foundation of her approach. General Kellerman, who had been listening to the discussion with evident interest, finally addressed the central question that had brought them together. "Ms. Mitchell, assuming we move forward with implementation, what timeline are you proposing for full deployment across our training systems?" Sarah had wrestled with this question extensively. Military culture favored decisive action, But her experience with organizational change suggested that sustainable implementation required patience and careful planning. General, I'm proposing a 3-phase approach over 18 months. Phase 1 involves pilot programs at 5 selected facilities, chosen to represent different training contexts and service branches. Phase 2 expands to 25 facilities based on lessons learned from the pilots. Phase 3 achieves full deployment across all major training commands. The timeline was ambitious but realistic, reflecting Sarah's understanding that military decision-makers needed to see concrete progress while allowing sufficient time for cultural adaptation and refinement of implementation procedures. Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly. That timeline allows for proper evaluation and adjustment without losing momentum. What kind of support structure are you envisioning for trainers who will be implementing these techniques? Sarah's response revealed the depth of her preparation. Colonel, will need a comprehensive train-the-trainer program, ongoing consultation support, and regular assessment of implementation fidelity. Most importantly, we'll need champions within each facility, respected trainers who can model the techniques and address resistance from their peers. The concept of internal champions reflected Sarah's growing understanding of military culture. Change initiatives that succeeded in military contexts typically did so because they were championed by respected members of the community rather than imposed by outside authorities. Brigadier General Webb, whose initial skepticism had gradually given way to professional interest, raised a practical concern. Ms. Mitchell, what happens when these techniques encounter resistance from trainees themselves? Soldiers who have been taught to suppress emotional responses might view psychological training as weakness. The question demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the challenges involved in changing not just training methodologies, but the underlying cultural attitudes that shaped how military personnel viewed stress and performance. General Webb, that's why the implementation needs to be positioned carefully, Sarah replied. These techniques aren't about managing emotions, they're about optimizing performance. When we frame them as tactical skills that enhance operational effectiveness, resistance decreases significantly. The reframing represented more than semantic manipulation. Sarah had learned that military personnel were far more receptive to psychological techniques when they understood them as performance enhancement tools rather than stress management strategies. As the meeting continued, Sarah found herself fielding questions that revealed the complexity of institutional change in military contexts. Officers raised concerns about training time allocation, resource requirements, integration with existing curricula, and potential conflicts with service-specific training traditions. Each question demonstrated the thorough analysis that preceded major training innovations in military culture. Unlike civilian organizations, where new methodologies might be implemented based on theoretical promise, military training systems demanded extensive validation and careful consideration of unintended consequences. Major General Patricia Stone, who commanded the Air Force Education and Training Command, brought up an issue that hadn't been previously addressed. Ms. Mitchell, how do these techniques adapt to different operational environments? What works for ground combat might not be appropriate for pilots or cybersecurity specialists. Question highlighted the diversity of military occupations and the need for training approaches that could be customized for different operational contexts while maintaining core effectiveness. General Stone, the psychological principles remain constant, but their application can be tailored to specific operational demands, Sarah explained. A pilot dealing with system failures needs the same cognitive flexibility as an infantry soldier in combat, but the specific scenarios and decision-making frameworks will be different. Her answer reflected months of consultation with specialists across different military occupational fields. The techniques she had developed were robust enough to maintain effectiveness across diverse contexts while remaining flexible enough to accommodate specific operational requirements. General Kellerman, who had been evaluating not just Sarah's methodology, but her readiness to lead such a significant initiative, made a decision that would reshape the trajectory of military training across the Department of Defense. Ms. Mitchell, based on what I've heard today, I'm prepared to authorize the pilot implementation phase. You'll have access to the resources and authority necessary to begin testing these techniques at selected facilities, with the understanding that expansion will depend on demonstrated results. The authorization represented a professional milestone that Sarah had never imagined when she first began her research into stress, response, and cognitive performance. From academic theory to classroom application to military training protocol, the journey had taken her far beyond the boundaries of traditional civilian research. As she looked around the table at the faces of officers who had just entrusted her with the responsibility for potentially revolutionizing military training, Sarah realized that her greatest challenges lay ahead. Proving that techniques worked in controlled environments was one thing. Implementing them successfully across the vast, complex, and culturally resistant institution of the American military would test every skill she had developed throughout her career. The meeting concluded with assignments of responsibilities and timelines for initial implementation steps. Sarah found herself at the center of an initiative that could affect the training of hundreds of thousands of military personnel, armed with techniques that had already proven their worth in the most demanding operational environments imaginable. 6 months after General Kellerman's authorization, Sarah stood once again in the Fort Bragg training facility where her journey had begun. The same high ceilings and industrial lighting surrounded her, but everything else had fundamentally changed. Where once she had faced a room of skeptical trainers, she now observed the graduation ceremony for the first class of military instructors, certified in her psychological training protocols. The transformation was visible in ways both subtle and profound. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, who had been among her harshest critics during that initial presentation, now stood before a group of junior officers demonstrating the breathing techniques that Sarah had once been ridiculed for teaching. His explanation carried the authority of personal experience and operational validation. "These aren't relaxation exercises," Thompson told his students, his voice carrying the conviction that came from having seen the techniques work in real training scenarios. "They're tactical skills. When your stress response threatens to overwhelm your decision-making capability, these protocols can mean the difference between mission success and mission failure." Sarah watched from the back of the room as Sergeant First Class Chun led a group through one of her adaptive stress integration exercises. The same soldier who had initially participated in her demonstration out of politeness now taught the techniques with the enthusiasm of a true convert. His students, seasoned NCOs from various special operations units, listened with the attention they typically reserved for weapons training or tactical instruction. The pilot program had exceeded every metric Sarah had proposed in her Pentagon presentation. Decision-making accuracy under stress had improved by an average of 43% across participating units. Training accident rates had dropped by 27% as soldiers learned to maintain situational awareness under pressure. Most significantly, post-training assessments showed that 91% of participants viewed the psychological techniques as valuable additions to their operational skill sets, rather than academic distractions. Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached Sarah, his expression reflecting the satisfaction of someone who had been vindicated by events. "Ms. Mitchell, I wanted you to know that I just received word from SOCOM headquarters. They're requesting expedited implementation of your protocols across all special operations training pipelines." The news represented the ultimate validation. The Special Operations Command's endorsement would accelerate adoption throughout the military community in ways that no amount of academic research could achieve. When the most elite units in the American military embraced new training methodologies, institutional resistance typically crumbled quickly. But Sarah's attention was drawn to a more personal moment unfolding near the front of the room. Captain Rebecca Foster, who had initially dismissed Sarah's techniques as kindergarten tactics, was quietly consulting with a young Marine lieutenant who had been struggling with performance anxiety during high-stress simulations. "Lieutenant Martinez," Captain Foster said, her voice carrying a patience that would have been unimaginable during Sarah's first presentation. "The techniques Ms. Mitchell developed aren't about eliminating stress. They're about understanding what your stress response is, telling you and using that information to maintain operational effectiveness." Sarah watched as Foster guided the young officer through a visualization exercise that would help him maintain cognitive flexibility during complex tactical scenarios. The transformation in Foster's approach represented something more significant than mere adoption of new training methods. It reflected a fundamental shift in how military professionals understood the relationship between psychology and performance. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, who had traveled from the Pentagon to observe the graduation ceremony, joined Sarah at the back of the room. Her notebook was filled with observations that would inform the next phase of implementation across all service branches. "Sarah, the results speak for themselves. But what impresses me most is how thoroughly these techniques have been integrated into military culture," Dr. Warren said. 6 months ago, suggesting that soldiers should work with their stress responses rather than overcome them would have been considered controversial. Now it's becoming standard doctrine. The cultural transformation had been the most challenging aspect of the entire initiative. Sarah had discovered that changing training methodologies required not just proving effectiveness, but reshaping fundamental beliefs about what constituted military strength and resilience. The success of the pilot program had demonstrated that psychological sophistication could coexist with traditional military values. Colonel Hayes, who had provided crucial support throughout the implementation process, approached with news that would define the next chapter of Sarah's career. "Ms. Mitchell, I've just received authorization from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Your training protocols are being designated as the standard curriculum for all military leadership schools. They want you to establish a permanent training institute here at Fort Bragg." The offer represented everything Sarah had hoped to achieve when she first began her research into stress response and cognitive performance. From academic theory to operational reality, her work had traveled a path that few civilian researchers ever experienced. The opportunity to establish a permanent institute would allow her to continue refining and expanding the techniques while training a new generation of military instructors. But as Sarah looked around the room at the soldiers who had embraced her methodology, she realized that the most significant transformation hadn't been institutional, it had been personal. The young civilian contractor who had nervously faced a room of skeptical trainers had evolved into someone who understood military culture from the inside and could navigate its complexities with confidence. Sergeant Major William Parsons, whose initial skepticism had been the most vocal, made his way across the room with the deliberate pace of someone carrying important news. "Ms. Mitchell, I wanted to let you know that the after-action reports from our recent training exercises show something remarkable. Units that have gone through your program are demonstrating improved performance metrics across every measurable category." The validation was comprehensive and undeniable. Sarah's techniques weren't just working, they were revolutionizing how military personnel performed under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. As the graduation ceremony concluded, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The ridicule she had faced during her initial presentation had been transformed into respect earned through demonstrated results. The skeptical trainers who had questioned her credibility had become her most effective advocates. Rodriguez approached one final time, his expression carrying the gravity of someone about to share classified information. "Ms. Mitchell, there's something I've been authorized to tell you. The unit I served with during my deployment to Afghanistan, the One where I first used Dr. Brennan's techniques. They've been following the development of your program. Sarah felt her pulse quicken, sensing that Rodriguez was about to reveal information that would provide closure to questions that had lingered throughout her journey. They wanted me to tell you that your independent research didn't just parallel classified protocols. In some cases, it improved on them. You've developed techniques that are more effective than what we were using in the field. The revelation struck Sarah with unexpected force. Her civilian research hadn't just recreated military methodologies, it advanced them. The academic rigor she had brought to the study of stress, response, and cognitive performance had produced innovations that enhanced even the most sophisticated military training programs. As the last of the newly certified instructors filed out of the training hall, Sarah stood alone in the space where her transformation had begun. The room that had once felt hostile now felt like home. The techniques that had been dismissed as impractical theory had become operational doctrine. 6 months earlier, she had entered this facility as an outsider hoping to gain acceptance for alternative training approaches. She was leaving it as the architect of a training revolution that would affect military personnel for generations to come. The trainer, who had been ridiculed for her methods, had become the woman who revolutionized military training. The Green Beret's validation had been just the beginning of a journey that transformed not just how the military approached psychological training, but how Sarah understood her own capabilities and potential. As she walked out of Fort Bragg for what she knew would be the last time as a visiting contractor, Sarah carried with her the knowledge that her work had proven something fundamental about the relationship between academic research and operational reality. The best innovations didn't come from either civilian or military perspectives alone. They came from the synthesis of both, applied with dedication, validated through experience, and implemented with respect for the culture they were meant to serve. The ridicule had ended. The revolution had begun. And Sarah Mitchell had discovered that sometimes the most powerful validation comes not from proving your critics wrong, but from helping them understand why you were right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.